Okay, welcome everyone. I know we have a big crowd coming and a few people still coming in, but in the interest of time, we want to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. It's hosted by the Georgia chapter of HFMA. I'm Laurie Heavey. I'm a Georgia HFMA Education Committee volunteer. Listen, I hope you guys have left your calendars open in October because we have tons of events slated, it seems like every week. Coming up next month. So please be sure to check out the events calendar on the Georgia HFMA website and sign up for all the events we have going on. We have a lot of education, a lot of networking, ton of stuff for you guys to do. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. All phone lines are on mute to avoid interruptions during the broadcast. Please submit your questions via the question box at any time, and I'll coordinate with our presenters at the end of the session so they can provide their answers to your questions. I will be setting up a link for the presentation. It will be available on the Georgia HFMA website soon, so please be on the lookout for that. And as well, by the end of the week, I'll be sending you all an email that contains links to the presentation, to the recording for today's session, as well as your continuing education form, which you can self-submit on the Georgia HFMA website. And then finally, before we get started with today's session, I'd like to take a second to recognize and thank our chapter sponsors. You can see all of their logos on the screen now, and we definitely appreciate your support. Today, our speakers are from EnableComp, Zachary Schultz and Ken Green, and they're going to be giving us an update on major developments for workers' compensation in Georgia. First, let me give you a little bit of background about Zach and Ken. After joining EnableComp in 2017, Zachary's primary focus was on the operational management of Florida clients. He became an internal subject matter expert for Florida workers' compensation, helping clients see consistent revenue and process improvement. He has since moved into the role of Director for Managed Care and is responsible for maintaining relationships with state regulatory agencies, large PPO networks, and payers. Zachary also monitors, analyzes, and communicates any legal developments and legislative changes impacting EnableComp's complex claims business. Ken has been with EnableComp since 2018, serving clients in the Southeast. During his career, Ken has worked in various sectors, including biomedical engineering, cardiology, information technology, and now revenue cycle. Most recently, Ken was part of Avelity's IDN health system provider division, delivering technologies and solutions for improving patient access workflow and revenue collections. So Zach and Ken, we're ready to begin. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. This is Ken. I just want to thank Georgia HFMA, first of all, for hosting this thing. And then secondly, for all of my Georgia friends for joining us this afternoon. So I really appreciate you showing up. And I'm just going to go through just a quick introduction of who EnableComp is and get it in Zach's hands as quickly as possible. EnableComp, for those of you who don't know, has been in business for 20 years. We started off as a workers' comp focused company. Actually, our original founder came from the dark side in workers' comp. He was actually with a payer and saw the need to help out the provider world, and that was the birth of EnableComp. Since that time, we've built ourselves out to really be what we're calling the complex claims expert, which includes motor vehicle, TPL, Veterans Administration, and of course the workers' comp world. So that's all we do. That's what we focus on. So we really have a high degree of capabilities in that marketplace. We don't get distracted with other things. That being said, we have over 800 hospitals nationwide, and there's a heat map, as you can see on the screen, giving us an idea of where we are most densely populated and reaching out to other parts of the country. People often ask, what gives you the advantage, Ken, with EnableComp versus maybe me trying to do it myself or maybe even some of our competitors? The first thing, I guess, is we are nationwide. The second thing is the way our teams are stood up. Our team members work exclusively in their area of expertise, so it's either work comp, motor vehicle, or veterans. They exclusively focus on that workplace, and therefore they become very, very proficient and experts at their individual job markets. The other thing is we're a technology-driven company, going way back from our founders, which has allowed us to really profile how the payer world works, regardless of which domain we're talking about. It also lets us really condition the claims as they come in. We have their state and federal contracts loaded into this tool. We have providers, local PPO and local contracts loaded into the tool. So once we get a claim in, we get an opportunity to really proof it, condition it, make sure the right values are being asked for and the right payer is being going to be hit for the first time. So it's a very powerful tool loaded with AI. It really gives our team the advantage over maybe someone that doesn't have such a technology to be as proficient with these complex claims. It's also the means by which we communicate with the payers and our providers. So it's very efficient. It helps our staff member keep up with timely filings. If a claim is to be delayed for any reason, an alert will go off and the staff can jump right on it. So it's a very powerful, very efficient way to do what it is we do. And the other thing I guess that's noteworthy is we have over $1.6 billion in collections nationwide. So that's just a little bit on EnableComp. I got one other introduction I'm going to do. A puppy friend of ours. Back in the day when we all could travel and be together, a year or so ago, we introduced Lex at one of the, well, actually many of the trade shows. As we moved into the veterans claim market, EnableComp wanted to practice what it preached. So we were looking out for a way to give back to our veterans. And we joined in with Patriot Paws about a year ago now, I guess it's been, where we sponsored a Labrador Retriever to be a support dog for one of our American Hero veterans. So Lex is going through his training, and as things will have it, he will graduate fall of 2021 and then be placed with one of our American Heroes to build a team with the two of them working through life and making that veteran's life a little bit easier. So that's a little bit on Lex, and at this point, I'm going to stop talking for a while and turn it over to Zach and get to the meat of the matter. So thanks again for being here.
Hey, thank you, Ken. And I appreciate Georgia HFMA and everybody else for taking the time to join us today. I'm excited to cover some stuff going on in Georgia and put some visibility on a few things that I think are important. And I appreciate everybody taking the time to spend time with us today. So just briefly, what we'll kind of go over is we'll start with a brief overview of the Georgia fee schedule. I realize this will probably be a little bit of review for most on the call, but I like to start with that information because sometimes it's relevant later on in the presentation. So we'll cover that, a few slides on just how some of the systems work. We'll talk about some current events in Georgia, one particularly that I think could have a pretty big impact on some AR. And then, you know, we'll obviously get into some COVID-19 stuff, which I'm sure everybody's really excited about. So like I said, just starting with some Georgia fee schedule stuff. It is published annually. The state of Georgia partners with Telehealth, and that's available for purchase on the Georgia Work Comp website, and we have a link for it in the presentation. So when it comes out later this week, if y'all do want to get your hands on a hard copy of that, we'll have a reference to that when we send everything to everybody. It has a Medicare base and influence. Most of the systems in place, if not all of them, start with some sort of Medicare methodology. Typically, nationally, states that have Medicare-based methods are on the lower end of average reimbursement, but with some of the uplifts provided in the Georgia model, it typically performs better than other Medicare-based systems nationally, according to some NCCI reporting, which is good because typically the Medicare systems are a little bit on the lower end compared to states with other systems like, per diems and whatnot. And so the most recent edition of this went into effect on April 1 of 2020. Typically right around Q2, if not April 1st on the money, that's when that gets released each year. So the most recent model is 4/1/2020, and we'll keep our eyes out for an update to that next April. All right, so starting out with the outpatient stuff and the physician stuff again, maybe getting repetitive, but Medicare-based, the physician model is going to use resource-based value scale. The outpatient and the ASC is going to be based on the outpatient prospective payment system with some uplift on various different situations. The maximum allowables for both these models are published yearly in that fee schedule that I mentioned on the last slide. One thing that I think is worth noting is there is lesser than language included in the Georgia fee schedule. Basically, that means that a bill can't reimburse higher than what the bill charges are. using a state like Florida, who doesn't have that language, if a line item is, billed for $100, but the table or the maximum shows it at $120. In Florida, you can collect that $120. In Georgia, you cannot. So I always like to make sure to mention that because that can influence some expectations of, when it comes to reimbursement with outpatient claims, especially. I also want to talk a little bit about multiple procedures. This is something we typically see with Georgia providers that can create some confusion. Basically how this works is if there's multiple procedures performed in the same situation, only one of those can be billed at 100% of maximum allowable, and the other ones are going to be paid at a discount. So how that works is the procedure with the highest relative weight will be 100% of the maximum allowable, and everything else after that will be 62.5%. The reason I like to mention this is because I know a lot of providers have systems or programs in place that calculate the reimbursement ahead of time, so you kind of have a good expectation on what you might be expecting for each bill. And if that's not loaded properly, sometimes it can create some some differences in what actually comes in compared to what you're expecting. And a lot of times, when you dig into maybe an underpaid outpatient bill that maybe contains some therapy, something like that, this is always the first thing I want to look at because this is typically something that does get overlooked from time to time. So I like to mention that as a reminder. So for the inpatient claims, it's a basic DRG with an outlier model. Those maximums are published every single year in the Georgia fee schedule, just like everything else. Anytime something's not included in the Georgia fee schedule with an inpatient claim, it'll reimburse at 62.5%. I rounded that up for easier math. It's actually 62.23%, but for the sake of making things easy, 62.5% is a good place to look. And then surgical implants, I think are kind of unique in Georgia because they only reimburse at the cost amount. In a state like Florida, and I apologize ahead of time for using Florida as my reference through this whole thing, but a state like Florida has some uplift involved in their implant reimbursement. So in Florida, it's cost times 1.6 or 160% of cost, where for providers in Georgia, those are just going to reimburse at the cost amount, and you will support that number by sending the invoices, with your bills when you submit them. Just to kind of elaborate on that a little bit, I would say that without a doubt, one of the top 2 denial reasons we see for inpatient claims in Georgia is those invoices not being included when you bill. So having those handy and ready to go when you send claims out that are, obviously fall in those situations is important, and to make things easier on everybody. So the Georgia Workers' Compensation Board establishes outlier payment for high cost cases. Outlier, stop loss, things like that are probably the most common managed care system that exists to make sure that above average cost claims are covered. Georgia's no different. They've got that in place to make sure that if there is something that's catastrophic or does have more costs associated to it, nobody's losing out on that, right? There's a method in place to make sure that that's compensated for, and that's probably the other of the top 2 denial reasons in Georgia. It's going to be the lack of documentation for the implants, and then the outlier payments we see a lot of friction on as well. And that's not just in Georgia either. That's throughout the entire country. I think inpatient above average cost claims are where payers tend to have the most concern and where we see the most underpayments. So that's not uncommon to other states either, but in Georgia, it's the implants and the outlier that we see the most issues with. All right, so I wanted to mention a few timely filing notes. You do have timely filing in Georgia in place. So, obviously you have to get your bills out in a certain amount of time. Payers have to pay them in a certain amount of time. You have to appeal them in a certain amount of time. I will say Georgia, compared to a state like Texas, has some provider favored rules in place. So for example, you have a year from date of service to bill your initial claim, whereas in a state like Texas, you only have 95 days, which, as we all know, can turn kind of tight, if maybe there's a mishap with registration or, any of a number of things that could go wrong with that initial first bill. 95 days can be kind of tight, but a year seems to be a pretty forgiving timeline. So once you get your bill in the mail, within a year of the service happening, and the provider receives it, they have 30 days to decide what to do with it. If they don't decide within those 30 days, there are some late charges associated with that. We won't get into what those are. Those are all available in any type of fee schedule information or reference that is available. But there are some late charges associated with that, which is nice. And once they do make a decision and you have a chance to review it, if you find issue with that, 120 days, you can submit an appeal to that payer and try to resolve that situation, between the two of y'all. So again, compared to other states that have timely filing rules in place, I think Georgia's is one of the easier ones to work with. I always like to use Texas as the timely filing reference because 95 days is a lot tighter than it might sound. So having that year to get that bill out is best case scenario, considering that you do have timely rules in place. All right, moving on to state disputes, and this is actually going to kind of transition us into some of the current event things I want to talk about. The state of Georgia does have a state dispute process, obviously. Part of that process, however, requires a state-sponsored peer review to take place prior to any hearings or mediation being scheduled. The issue with that right now is the state of Georgia currently does not have a peer review vendor in place. The last communication that I got from, folks at the state, and the last time I was able to touch base with them, they did say that they were in final discussions or preliminary discussions rather, with a potential vendor, but that they weren't ready to announce who or what that was. And they were kind of working through all of that. So what's kind of concerning about that situation is there's really no outside escalation point currently, in the state of Georgia. And it's kind of concerning because if you can't obviously come to that arrangement or agreement that we talked about on the last slide, you have limited escalation options. So if you take an outlier claim, which again, we'll talk about that on the next slide, but take an outlier claim who, underpays the most or typically have the highest bill charges. They're the most reviewed and disputed claims. Not having that third party that can weigh in and give a ruling or make a recommendation, is really troublesome because you run out of some options that you might have had previously. So it's a concerning situation, especially with the amount of AR that could be tied up in something like an outlier claim. So what's at risk? Like I said, the outlier claims are the most underpaid claims in the state of Georgia. In fact, using some data from our inventory, over 60% of our balances after initial payment were outlier claims. Obviously, those claims are going to be higher bill charge, so they're going to make up the majority of the balance. But still, if you look at everything from a volume AR standpoint, using the clients that we have, 60% of those are to outlier bills. And state dispute processes, not just in Georgia, but in any state, are typically the highest percentage way that we get those claims paid. So, with the outlier claims being the top two denied reasons rather, the implants aren't as impacted by this because in most cases they're paid at cost. Nobody's really stressing it. There's no uplift. You get the invoices out, everybody's good to go. But the outlier claims, they have some debate involved, right? Because, they pay differently than a different type of inpatient claim or a regular inpatient claim. There's the debate on cost. There's the debate on medical necessity. There's a million different reasons why, a payer could not want to go down that road of writing a check for an outlier claim. And that's where this peer review from the state comes in handy. So, like I said, we currently don't have that in place. So the outlier claims are, the biggest red flag for us when we review potential impact of this. All right. So in the meantime, there are some things that I think that we can do to push AR and to get these claims, resolved. And I know that 2020, especially, getting money in the door is number one priority, and having claims linger around because, there might not be a system that's functioning is frustrating. So a couple of solutions that we've come up with and have had recommended to us are negotiations. One of the recommendations rather that was made to me by the state of Georgia was working directly with the payer to try to, come to some sort of agreement with the balances. Whether that is before initial payment is made, once a decision was given and you're in the appeal, you're in that 120-day appeal window, whatever. But working with that payer and seeing if you can come to agreement on something that is an amount that you both agree on, a situation that you both agree on, could be a result rather in a quicker turnaround time when it comes to these balances, as opposed to, them just sitting, in a filing cabinet somewhere waiting for, the state of Georgia to get that process up and running again. Obviously we want to be proactive and try to get these things resolved. I recommend, in the negotiation situations to try to do that before initial payment is made. Typically, you're a lot more successful in situations like that. And you can leverage some things to your advantage if you're able to jump in to this process earlier in the rev cycle or the bill cycle. For example, you can negotiate prompt payment agreements. So let's say hypothetically, you're comfortable with 5% of this bill being discounted under the stipulation that payer writes a check for you for that amount, the day after tomorrow. You can obviously weigh the pros and cons of how much you discount on that bill compared to what you're getting in return. But a couple things that can be used to leverage a prompt payment is maybe something that's not overly concerning to you money-wise off the top, to allow that check to be cut a little bit earlier is always helpful. And then the second thing I always recommend is make sure that any agreements or front-end negotiations that you may work through while we don't have that escalation point, make sure that there's language included in those that waive the payer's right to re-review the bill once you agree on something. There's nothing worse than getting somebody to agree to 98% of what you're wanting, telling you they're going to cut a check tomorrow. They send that back for processing, and then somebody gets their hands on it and starts chopping the bill up, and then all of a sudden it's 98% of a number that you had never seen before. So those are the two things I always recommend to make sure they're included in negotiated situations are some sort of prompt payment structure. 98% of something you don't see for 2 years is not to anybody's benefit. And the waiving the right to the second review, because you want to leave that situation, especially if 2 to 5% of what you were originally expecting is going to be gone. You want to leave that situation confident in the dollar amount that you agreed to. So just two things I always recommend people make sure of when they start negotiating on claims and may be held up in these situations. And also too, worth noting that I just thought of, the majority of the negotiators that handle these for payers are third-party vendors, and a lot of them are incentivized by making these deals. So things like prompt payment, waiving that second review, those aren't out of the realm of possibility. I mean, things like that happen all the time. It's to their benefit to make these deals happen. So typically a pretty easy thing to leverage. That way you turn a situation where claims are stuck to something that could potentially be to your advantage, which I think is the name of the game really when it comes to rev cycle. And then secondly, nurse review. We've got a registered nurse on site who, for Enable Comp, whose prime focus is to cater appeals and bills with clinical information included. Talking again about the outlier claims, the whole reason that exists is to compensate for above average cost claims. And now if you can have an expert included in your bill cycle or appeal cycle that can explain and illustrate, why that is the way that it is, obviously you can leverage some good faith in some of these payers who, obviously payer provider maintaining a positive relationship is to everybody's benefit. So, if you're able to illustrate, the added costs and the added effort that went into that treatment, maybe a payer is more likely to pay that outlier and pay that higher amount. So those are two things we've had extreme success with in the meantime while we sort of wait for this to get resolved. Obviously other legal routes exist, demand letters, things like that obviously I urge everybody to take advantage of if you're able to, because one thing that we don't want to happen is for our money to just get stuck while people go through processes, right? We need to make sure that we do have options that we can leverage to get, what's owed back to us and make sure that, the services that we offer are paid for. So you do have options. And then, if after this or anything, anybody wants to talk about those options in more detail, I'm obviously up for that. Just reach out. So moving on from that, I want to get into some COVID-19 stuff. Because this is kind of going to be the biggest deal and what we'll talk about the most here, because COVID-19 has had a massive impact on workers' compensation, so much so that I don't think anybody realized how big of an impact it would have probably last March when this all started. And the unique thing about COVID-19 and its impact on workers' compensation is, for the first time and only time that I can think of, the consensus and it was agreed that it was just dangerous in the world. And everybody, you had to hunker down, quarantine, stay inside. And if you didn't, you could get this infection that's harmful, and nobody wanted that. We need to control the outbreak. However, there are certain folks, and I'm sure there are a lot of them who are on this call today, who weren't able to do that because they're vital to our infrastructure, and the world has to continue to go around while all this happens. So there are some folks who, weren't able to shelter in place, and they did have to continue going to work. Now, the question that kind of posed is, what happens when one of these folks who are out there keeping the world going while this pandemic is happening? What happens when one of them gets COVID-19? And for a long time, and honestly, even still today, I'm not sure that everybody fully knows how to handle that situation. Where this all started getting national attention, COVID-19 and compensability, started in the beginning of the pandemic, back March, April, early April, late March, with a wrongful death lawsuit in Illinois. An employee lost his life to COVID-19. His family felt, his employer had an obligation to not have him, be at work. And they went down a legal route, because of that. And while I won't get into, obviously what the outcome of that was, one takeaway from that is really important to us on the call is the state of Illinois issued an emergency order saying that anybody who works or is deemed essential and is an essential employee infected with COVID-19, it's rebuttably presumed to be work-related. That's an enormously big deal because COVID-19 claims by default would fall under occupational disease rules. We'll go over what those look like in Georgia here in a couple slides, but those rules weren't necessarily catered towards something like COVID-19. I like to tell everybody, think occupational disease, think black lung in a coal miner or something of that nature. There's a lot of different things that have to be verified. There's a lot of boxes that need to be checked before an occupational disease can be ruled compensable. In fact, I think it's probably one of the toughest work comp claims to prove. So these claims don't have a lot of momentum to start with. So that this rebuttable presumption, it flips that, right? So now all of a sudden you've got to prove that those things didn't happen. So as difficult as it is to prove the casual relationship, it's equally as difficult to prove that there wasn't one, right? So having that burden of proof swapped over to the payer side can have a massive impact. Now, that bill didn't stay around for very long. I think within a month it was removed and they had a different one issued that covered less people. It was a big to-do, but what it did do is push a lot of other states throughout the country to follow in their place. At the time of making this, there were 14 states who had either issued an emergency order or passed legislation addressing COVID-19 compensability. That number is actually 15 today because the state of California last week enacted a law out there covering first responders and firefighters that went into effect on 9/17. So that number is actually 15. This slide was created, before last Thursday, so we didn't have a chance to update it. And 11 states have similar proposals under review. That's actually 10 now. So one of the 11 got enacted. So we're at 15 current and 10, being reviewed. There's a slide later that I love and I get really excited about every time I do this because it kind of shows the momentum that other states are having nationally on COVID-19 and what they're trying to push through. And it's all really exciting. And I'm pretty excited to show it to you. And then we'll move on to that now, actually. All right, so this is a graph that's going to show which states have passed legislation, which states have enacted legislation, which states have proposed legislation, and which states have emergency orders in place. As you can see, the California was under proposed when we made this, but that's actually gone into effect. It went into effect, like I said, 9/17, so that's a green state now, but this paints a good picture of which states nationally have laws in place. As I'm sure you're looking at Georgia, which is a state with no color associated to it. That's currently the case. There isn't anything in Georgia that is going to help with those compensability claims. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But we're able to see the impact that that does have nationally when those things do go in place. So I wanted to illustrate what's happening nationally. And then this next graph is going to show the difference in what workers are actually covered by these situations. So you have everything from states like Utah, who cover first response healthcare workers. That California bill that we discussed earlier is the same way. That's just going to cover, you know, your first responders, all the way up to a state like Vermont or Wyoming, who covers everybody. Every employee is covered. If you're working during the pandemic and you get COVID-19, it is covered by work comp. And then, you know, everything in the middle, essential employees. So the majority of the essential employees employee bills rather, are probably mapped out. Most of them will reference an emergency order that was made earlier, you know, that you know, mentions which industries are covered, which aren't. But I thought this is a really cool graphic that shows just the wide range of differences between who's covered and who's not, and the impact that they can have. For example, the state of Florida, this is only legislative activity, it's not emergency orders, but if you look at the state of Florida compared to the state of California, they both had emergency orders enacted while they kind of decided what their legislation was going to be. The state of California order actually covered all essential workers, so they would have been in the middle category of this graph here. Anybody who was deemed essential by Governor Newsom's executive order was covered, rebuttable presumption. You got COVID-19, unless proven otherwise, it was work-related. In Florida, they had just the healthcare, first response workers, things like that covered. Using the same body of data over the summer of 2020, so from the start of the pandemic to, or when those rules went into place rather, to the end of August, California had 23% of their COVID-19 claims denied. The state of Florida had 46%. So almost double the amount of claims, almost half of their overall COVID-19 claims were denied just because they had less people covered by these orders. Now, in a state like Georgia, where there's nothing in place, you know, imagine what that number could look like when there's no rebuttable presumption, you know, issued for anyone. So it's pretty concerning, and it makes it kind of tough to work through these COVID-19 claims. And then this is the slide that I get really excited about because it shows how many bills per state have passed through the legislation or passed through the system. I think it paints a really great picture of which states are being active when it comes to making work comp changes to make COVID-19 a little bit more, you know, a little bit easier to work and making those benefits a little bit more available. So you can see states like New York, California have been extremely active in making sure that work comp was, you know, considered with COVID-19. And then, you know, you've got states like Texas who aren't in session or not able to do anything about it. And then, you know, some of the blue states throughout the country, you know, have fewer than 10 bills introduced. Unfortunately, Georgia is one of those states that doesn't have a lot of movement, but I do think that that will change as time goes by. But I like to show this because it shows the more active states compared to the less active states. So you can kind of paint yourself a picture of what to expect when it comes to any type of adjustment being made COVID-19 related. All right, so COVID-19 specifically in Georgia. As of 8/27, the Georgia Department of Public Health said there were almost 300,000 cases. Over 15,000 of those were involving healthcare workers. So in the state of Florida, right now, currently, the average bill size of a COVID-19 claim is $6,500. So $6,500 times 15,000, you know, that's a lot of guaranteed money that could have went into work comp benefits for some healthcare workers who had maybe gotten infected by COVID-19 while they were at work, opposed to, you know, now in the situation in Georgia where there's nothing there supporting them who maybe don't have access or as easy access to those benefits. So just one example of how big of an impact even the most, you know, even the smallest compensability pieces of legislation can have on people's bottom lines. You know, that can end up being a lot of money over time. But because y'all don't have anything in place, these bills are going to go through the occupational disease rules like I talked about earlier. So in Georgia, Title 34, Chapter 9, Article 8 of the Georgia Code covers compensability for occupational disease. It goes into a lot of detail on what's included and what's not. I made note of 4 different things that have to be proven before something can be compensable under occupational disease. And I think this shows a good picture of why that's kind of tough with COVID-19, right? So you have to prove a direct causal connection between the infection and the work being performed. Okay, I'm a nurse and I'm treating people who have the infection. Okay, I can probably do that. Next, you have to prove the disease is not of a character to which substantial exposure outside of their employment exists. All right, well, that's tougher because you can't watch the news for 1 minute or TV for 1 minute without everybody saying COVID-19 can come from anywhere. So, okay, anybody who is a remotely good arguer can probably leverage that to their advantage. Prove the disease is not an ordinary disease of life where the general public is exposed. Well, okay, we know the general public is exposed, so that's something that can be used against the compensability of that claim. And then you have to prove the infection's origin of risk is connected with the employment. Again, that's going to be an easier thing to do for a nurse than it is a software developer, right? Those types of things are more frequent in a hospital setting. So, but anyways, there's a lot of things that are pretty abstract that you have to cover and prove and identify before anybody's going to write a check for a COVID-19 work comp claim that it's just impossible to do. I went to a webinar, not to get too off topic, but I went to a webinar a couple months ago, and there were two different enormous employers who were on this call. Both of the employees were self-insured, so they handled their own work comp situations. And this was in the heat of the pandemic, and everything was max level ramped up when it came to COVID-19. And somebody asked them how they make the decision to give benefits or not give benefits. And it was kind of ironic because one employer said, we just give them to everybody. It's vague, it's tough to prove. We'd rather not deal with any potential blowback. We know we don't have to via the rules, but we asked our employees to be here. They're infected. We're going to pay for their COVID-19 treatment. And the other employer who's in the exact situation said the exact opposite. Too bad, so sad. Rules don't cover it. I don't know where you traveled in the last couple of months or what you do with your free time, not covering it. So the community is pretty split in half on how those things should be handled. So, not to beat a dead horse, but these orders being in place and these bills getting passed and this legislation going into effect and COVID-19 related situations being added to work comp fee schedules is so helpful in the processing of these bills, because without them, you don't have a lot of options to prove what benefits are available to you. Again, and talk more about the COVID-19 claims complexity. We talked enough about the compensability and how difficult that is. I think everybody gets it. One thing that I do like to make note of too when I talk about this is COVID-19 testing. So throughout all of this and throughout the pandemic ramping up and going through the summer, a lot of changes have taken place when it came to COVID-19 testing. In the beginning, there weren't codes available. We were seeing everything from, generic pneumonia test codes to anything else. And, CMS eventually, well into the pandemic recommended some codes. I think there's 5 or 6 of them. Said, hey, these are the codes that you're going to use. These are how you're going to bill for your testing. However, those codes didn't have allowables attached to them at first. So there's a block of time where you had the code, no allowable. So nobody was really sure how to reimburse these things. For a long time, it was the local MAC's responsibility to establish what those would be. A couple months later, they added some allowables to them. They're anywhere between $35 to $55, depending on, which test is used. But, there's a good 4-month gap where there was a lot of confusion on how these tests could be handled. And just to kind of drill down on that even more, work comp specifically poses a little bit different of a risk and a little bit different of a complex situation when it comes to testing, because every provider throughout the country or different areas have different procedures around COVID-19 testing. One example we see all the time in every state in the country is I'm at work, I get up to use the restroom, I fall, I break my leg, they take me in, I'm triaged or whatever, and I'm going through how I'm feeling, and I check the boxes of some of the COVID-19 systems, or symptoms rather. They recommend a test. I agree. I take it. Turns out I do or don't have COVID-19, whatever, but that test ends up in the work comp bill. So there are some providers out there that write it off, whatever, it's $100, no big deal. Some providers, want to bill for that. So that, that's another thing where the community is kind of split in half, where some people are, okay, whatever, I'm going to eat this test. Some people are, no, we wouldn't have had to test this person if he wouldn't have gotten hurt at work. So it's work related. They see that as something that should be compensated for. And while we'll obviously, as a company, do everything we can to collect and reimburse for our clients anything that's possible, I always like to try to recommend just having the right expectations when it comes to COVID-19 testings, especially on something where the diagnosis isn't COVID-19 or it's something unrelated. Those are very, very tough to they're very, very tough to prove. For example, Florida, they don't have a Medicare-based system like y'all do. So in Georgia, the stuff issued by CMS is going to be a little bit more rule, a little bit more usual and customary for a state like Georgia, whereas in Florida, they have their own methodology in place. So one of the conflicts we had with folks there was, okay, well, should I expect, $0, the $35 recommended by CMS? Should I expect 6% of bill charges because that's the situation? What should I expect for these tests? And I just tell everybody, you got to have an open mind with these until 2021 schedules start getting released. My hope is a lot of this stuff will be hammered down and illustrated a little bit clearer, once new models start to be released. But for now, I like to recommend everybody just kind of having an open mind with the COVID-19 tests, especially when they're attached to work comp bills. If you get something, great. If you don't, it is what it is, because it's not something that adding a bunch of man hours to trying to appeal and argue for such a small amount is worth it. The success rate and it's not very high percentage. So having the right expectations for that is really important. And then the last thing I want to talk about is telehealth. So in Georgia, your 4-1 fee schedule, so the most recent edition, does include telehealth rules. And a notice was issued to the state letting everybody know about that. I had a little bit of a tough time finding any tangible data around the impact that that's had in Georgia. So again, I'm sorry to keep referencing Florida, but I have so much of that information available and they're a neighbor of yours. So I thought it was relevant to kind of show an impact it could have. So I used some Florida metrics because they actually had a similar situation to where they issued a notice on telehealth and work comp the exact same week that the state of Georgia did. So most states have seen massive increases from 2019 to 2020 in telehealth, which is totally to be expected. I don't think anything's surprised by that. So using Florida data, they went from over 1,600 claims in 2019 to almost 28,000 at the end of August of this year. Obviously, that's an exaggerated metric because of what's happening in the world. I do, however, think that visibility is a big deal, and I think telehealth was already something that was growing, and it's already something that people were wanting more access to. And now that we've sort of shown that it can work or it could work, I see that being a more recommended or preferred treatment method for work comp claims going forward. Some states throughout the country, Florida again, we're having already like 100, 200% increases in their claims. Now, obviously those jumps were small because there weren't a lot of cases. And I don't think there'll be 30,000 cases of telehealth next year in any state. I do, however, think the visibility provided by COVID-19 makes this something that should be on everybody's radar and something everybody should be really excited about. And really occupational disease as well. One thing that I can't stress enough, and I believe to my core to be the case, is I think COVID-19 has changed telehealth and occupational disease and work comp forever. I don't think pre-COVID-19 getting the flu from somebody at work being work-related, would ever cross anybody's mind. But now that we've seen that now that COVID-19's put more visibility on airborne illness, things like that, I do think that occupational disease is going to take up more of people's overall COVID-19 or work comp claims rather in incoming years. And I do think having a good running knowledge and understanding of those rules is really important because it's only going to happen more often. People talk about a second wave, all the time, and being ready to rock with these rules and regulations and which states have them, which states don't, could make that transition a lot smoother than maybe things were back in March when it kind of hit us all by surprise. And telehealth is the same thing. There's a lot of nuance involved in billing telehealth, place of service, things like that, how that stuff is all billed. Those things are all different from a normal work comp claim, and I recommend everybody, do some research into that because I don't think these things are going away, even as the pandemic winds down. I do think some of the impact that this has had is long-term. And I think that learning from the experience we've had this year is only going to make things easier on us if and when things like this happen again. And then just a couple graphs to illustrate what I was talking about with COVID-19. This is Florida data again. Sorry about that. But as you can see in April, when their notice was issued, same week as yours, they had almost 11,000 claims, which is by far more than they did in any other month that telehealth's ever existed. Now that's leveled off a little bit over time, but you can see the impact that notice being issued had on that state's workers' compensation. And then this just shows the jump from 2017 to 2019, or 2020 rather. And this is again the state of Florida. You can see they were already on an uptick for telehealth claims. 2020 is obviously an exaggerated metric, but it'd be foolish to think that that wasn't going to continue to grow and even more rapidly as time goes by. So not to be redundant or repetitive, but having a working knowledge and understanding of how these claims need to be billed and work has never been more important. There's a lot of really great resources out there that illustrate all of these things, and I'd be happy to send that stuff out when the presentation gets released at the end of the week as well. Yeah, so we can take some questions now if you're ready.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Zach and Ken. We do have some questions here, and before we get started with that, I just want to remind everyone, if you have additional questions, please be sure to use the Q&A box, and we'll get them in the queue here. The first question, can you address the fact that the Georgia Workers' Compensation Board fee schedule has language that an ACS must follow the OPPS status indicators as opposed to the payment indicators? By doing this, almost all CPT has a J1 indicator. This virtually eliminates all multiple procedures, including bilateral procedures. This does not follow Medicare guidelines. So not so much a question as, can you address that comment?
So yeah, I would want to do just a little bit of research on that and send that out to the group, just because I don't want to address it in the wrong way or give the wrong information. So if it's possible to, connect with our coders that we have on site and make sure that we give, obviously, the most accurate information out to the group would be okay. I can send that out, obviously, to everybody involved.
Okay. Next question. Self-insured plans aren't regulated by the Georgia Health Insurance Commissioner's Office. Would this have any effect on workers' compensation claims?
I don't think that it would, because the majority of those, and I'm assuming that they're mentioning, when it comes to the escalation methods that we talked about, I wouldn't think so, because a lot of those, self-insured plans or even any network plan in general, they typically have their own escalation methods mapped out in place. So, you wouldn't be utilizing any type of state-specific work comp escalation in those claims typically anyways. So I don't think that it would have an impact. And if it did, I think it would be a smaller one than just a run-of-the-mill work comp claim.
Okay. All right. Next question. How are payers and employers determining if they cover a COVID-19 workers' compensation claim?
Yeah, like I had mentioned earlier, the two employers on the webinar that I attended, people are using a lot of different methods. Some people are just going on good faith, trying to make sure they take care of their employees the best way they can, and others are leveraging those occupational disease rules. So definitely could see it go both ways. I do think that with the absence of any type of legislation being in place, like it is in Georgia, I think there are a lot more opportunities for an employer to not issue or not issue work comp benefits or not offer them. I think there's probably more situations where that's the case, and more situations where if they do go down that road, that those can be disputed or denied. So I think without the presence of a bill or an order or something like that, I think that it's really kind of up to the situation and up to the employer on how they would make that decision.
Okay. Next question, sorry. Besides negotiating nurse review, what are other steps I can take to lower any potential negative impact while the state puts a peer review vendor in place?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just in any situation in general, I always urge everybody to make sure that, and this is going to seem really obvious, but it's not as obvious as you think. Just making sure that your initial bill packet that goes out is as clean and efficient as possible. For example, the implant invoices, making sure those are included, making sure that the bill's billed properly, making sure that nothing's overlooked or excluded when that bill gets initially sent out. That way you eliminate anything that's going to cause problems on the back end that you can control, right? And then you really are just filtering out anything other than actual disagreements between provider and payer that have to be resolved through those other methods. But I just urge everybody, as obvious as it sounds, to make sure that initial bill packet that goes out is validated, the information is accurate, the addresses are right, all the documentation is included. All of those little things that sometimes can be solved by a simple phone call, make sure that stuff gets taken care of before you send the bill out. And I think you'll have a lot less situations where you even have to consider the impact that has.
Okay. Again, just reminding everyone, if you have a question for Zach or Ken, please be sure to use the Q&A box. Great. Next question. Are there any special considerations to make when billing telehealth claims?
There are, yes. Again, I mentioned it briefly, place of service, different things like that, all are kind of nuanced. I use DOL for an example all the time. DOL has very specific ways that type of service, place of service need to be included or not included on these bills. There is actually a resource, I want to make sure I get this website right, that houses all of this information. It's called the National Telehealth Resource Center, and they've got a link that you can see, and I'm sure HFMA has all that information available too. But they have all of it housed state by state, how state A needs to see these billed compared to how state B does, how DOL needs them to be billed compared to how DOE needs them to be billed. But yeah, there are too many special considerations to really even, that we don't have enough time to even get into, but there are a lot of resources available to help you with that. And maybe there's probably going to be a little trial and error involved in that too until the process becomes more structured and streamlined. But a lot of resources available that can kind of fill those gaps, and I can include that as well, some of those resources when we send out the presentation at the end of the week.
That'd be great, Zach. And actually, if you have that website address handy, if you want to just post it into the chat box real quickly, people can take that now too. Yeah, and just a reminder, everyone, during as Zach and Ken have been talking, I did give you the website for Georgia HFMA, where you can download their presentation. It's the presentation is on the Georgia HFMA website now if you want to download it there. And then, so Allie, I saw that you just put that out there, the telehealthresourcecenter.org. You sent that to me, so I'm going to real quickly put this out here for everyone else. Oh, there you go. Great. Perfect. Okay. All right. Okay, so Zach and Ken, that concludes the Q&A portion. I don't see any other questions in the chat box or in the Q&A box. So again, thanks everybody for participating. And of course, Zach and Ken, thanks so much for sharing your expertise. Our next webinar is October 13th, and will be part of HFMA's Region 5 webinar day. We'll have 5 sessions throughout the day starting at 9 a.m. And the theme of the webinars will focus on virtual patient engagement, including clinical and financial touch points. The session that we're going to host, Georgia HFMA, that session is going to be preserving the patient financial experience virtually. So please be on the lookout for registration information. We're working on all of that now, and I think probably the first email on Region 5 webinar day will be coming out maybe Friday. And then also our second webinar for October, our Wednesday webinar series, that's going to be on the 21st of October, and the topic is leveraging your physician advisor. And you'll remember at the top of today's session, I told you to not make any other plans because we have a ton of activity for you in October. So we have virtual networking next week and in October. And then we have the payer forum, which is going to be the week of October 12th, several days that week. We have a virtual forum on October 20th. As I mentioned, we have Wednesday webinars October 13th and October 23rd. And then we have Mactoberfest on October 21st and 22nd. So lots to go on. And so again, be sure to look out for the Georgia HFMA emails that will have all the details and your registration links. Again, Zach and Ken, thanks so much for taking time to present your topic for us today. Really a lot of good information there. And everyone else, thank you also for joining us. Stay safe and have a great afternoon. This concludes our webinar today.
Thank you very much.